Jake had been counting the days for this moment, the moment he could finally leave the bustle of the city behind. The sun was setting as he unloaded the last few boxes from his moving truck, the orange glow casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. This was supposed to be his fresh start, a peaceful retreat in a well-kept neighborhood where everything seemed perfect. The air was crisp, and the sound of distant lawnmowers hummed like a peaceful lullaby. But that calm would shatter in an instant. Out of nowhere, a woman appeared at the end of his driveway, storming toward him with the kind of purposeful stride that could only belong to someone who had spent too many years commanding respect. Her floral blouse billowed around her as she walked, almost as if it were some sort of battle flag, and her high heels clicked menacingly against the pavement. She was a small woman, but her presence was anything but. She approached Jake with the kind of intensity that made him feel as though he'd already broken some unspoken rule of the neighborhood. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp as a whip, cutting through the otherwise tranquil atmosphere. Jake paused, the box in his hand suddenly feeling heavier, as if the weight of the situation was beginning to sink in. He straightened, half expecting a neighbor to introduce themselves. Instead, she fixed him with an unblinking stare, piercing blue eyes that sized him up, scrutinizing his every movement. "I'm Carol," she said, her words leaving no room for pleasantries. "I'm the HOA president. And you," she added, "are already in violation of community rules." Jake blinked, momentarily confused. What do you mean?" he asked, trying to stay polite. He was used to the occasional HOA complaint in the past, but this seemed different. "Your car," she snapped, pointing a finger at the parking spot he pulled into. "You can't park here." Her eyes narrowed with accusation, as if his temporary use of the spot was some grand act of rebellion. Jake frowned, glancing at his car. Nothing extravagant, just a sit-in. He had parked there to unload his moving boxes, but Carol didn't seem interested in hearing his explanation. She was already on the offensive, her arms crossed and her stance defensive, as if he'd already committed a serious crime. "I'm just unloading. I'll move it as soon as I'm done," Jake said, trying to diffuse the tension. It was a simple mistake. Surely she'd understand. He hadn't even thought twice about where he parked. It was just a temporary spot, a few feet from the curb. But Carol wasn't listening. Instead, her lips curled into a tight, almost imperceptible smile, one that sent a shiver down his spine. "It doesn't matter. You're in violation of HOA rules, and I'm going to have to report this to the board." Jake's chest tightened. He wasn't sure if she was overreacting, or if he had just unknowingly stepped into some sort of HOA war zone. But as Carol turned on her heel and marched back to her house, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something bigger, something he wasn't prepared for. Without another word, Carol disappeared into her house, but the weight of her words lingered in the air, like the storm clouds before a thunderstorm. Jake stood frozen, staring at the driveway where she had stood. "Report this to the board." He shook his head, trying to shrug off the unsettling feeling that had settled in his stomach. But little did he know, his first encounter with Carol wasn't just the start of a petty dispute. It was the beginning of a chain of events that would spiral completely out of control. The kind of events that would leave Jake standing at the center of a tangled web of secrets, deception, and the law. The next morning, the sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Jake had only been there for a day, but the atmosphere already felt like a prison. Every perfectly trimmed lawn, every freshly painted mailbox, felt like another unwritten rule. But what had unsettled him the most was Carol. Her presence lingered in the air like the sharp scent of bleach, clean but inescapable. Jake stepped out of his front door, coffee in hand, ready to take on the day. He hadn't expected much, just a normal day of unpacking and settling in. But as soon as he opened the door, he spotted her, Carol, standing at the end of his driveway. This time, her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, Her eyes locked onto him like a predator stalking its prey. He froze, his hand still holding the door. What now? Without waiting for him to speak, Carol wasted no time. I'm here to make sure you understand the rules, she snapped, her voice as sharp as a broken shard of glass. Jake sighed, trying to stay calm. I've already moved the car. Everything's fine. Carol ignored him, her gaze unwavering. She was already too far gone in her righteous indignation. You don't get it, she continued, marching toward him with an air of authority. This isn't just about your parking spot. This is about respect for the community and its standards. And you, my friend, are already in violation of more than one of them. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. More than one. What in the world had he done now? He hadn't even fully unpacked yet, hadn't even begun to learn the neighborhood rules. Look, Jake said, his patience beginning to wear thin. I just moved in yesterday. I'm not trying to cause any trouble. Carol's lips curled into a thin smile, one that felt more like a sneer than anything friendly. Oh, you think this is just about parking? She asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. You should have read the HOA bylaws before you even thought about moving in here. There are rules about how to live in this neighborhood. You're already ticking off all the boxes for trouble. Jake's heart began to pound. This wasn't just about a misplaced car. She was scrutinizing his every move, digging into things he hadn't even considered. He had already made an enemy in this neighborhood, and he hadn't even unpacked his couch yet. Before Jake could respond, Carol took out her phone. His eyes widened. No way. Is she really going to call the cops over this? Without a second thought, Carol lifted the phone to her ear, her voice rising with righteous fury. Yes, I need to report a suspicious individual, she began, her tone sharp and filled with venom. He's already in violation of multiple HOA rules, and I'm afraid he's up to something shady. He's parked illegally, and now he's acting like he owns the place. I think he might be a criminal. Jake's breath caught in his throat. She couldn't be serious. She was calling 911 over something so trivial. Shady. A criminal. Was she really this convinced? The world seemed to slow as he watched her speak into the phone. The words were garbled at first, but the cold certainty in her voice sent a chill down his spine. Yes, this is urgent, she continued, her eyes flashing with something darker than just a sense of control. He's making everyone uncomfortable. Jake's fists clenched, but he didn't move. He was frozen. What was going on here? Why did she sound so convinced he was some sort of villain? Why was she going so far? Was this really just a parking dispute? Or had he stepped into something far bigger than he realized? The 911 dispatcher's calm voice came through the phone, but Carol's words grew louder as she described Jake in the most incriminating light she could. Her accusations painted him as a criminal, someone dangerous, someone who needed to be dealt with immediately. He could almost feel her satisfaction at having someone to report, at having power over him. She wasn't just the HOA president. She was a woman used to getting what she wanted. In that moment, something inside Jake snapped. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This was personal. He had become the target of a woman who was so obsessed with rules and control that she was willing to tear his life apart over something so trivial. He stepped back toward the door, ready to slam it shut, but then he heard it. The sound of sirens, faint at first, but growing louder by the second. His stomach churned. No, she couldn't have really called them, could she? Jake turned and glanced out at the street, where the distant sound of police sirens echoed closer, coming straight toward him. The dread settled in like a weight on his chest. Carol was serious. And soon, the law would arrive, not to protect him, but to answer her call. The sirens grew louder with each passing second, an unmistakable warning that things were about to escalate. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen on his doorstep. Carol, standing a few feet away, held the phone to her ear like a weapon, her eyes glinting with a sense of righteousness that felt as cold as ice. The sound of the sirens grew closer, and Jake felt a cold sweat form on the back of his neck. This couldn't be happening. He had barely moved into this quiet neighborhood, and already this woman was threatening to ruin everything. All over a parking spot. How did it come to this? He was about to shut the door and ignore the madness when Carol's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "They're coming," she said, her lips curling into a triumphant smile. "You'll see. You're not above the law." Jake's chest tightened as the first squad car turned the corner and slowed to a stop at the end of the driveway. His stomach dropped. The blue and red lights flickered across his porch, casting an eerie glow on the quiet street. A sinking feeling of dread settled deep within him. It wasn't just the sirens that made his blood run cold. It was the certainty in Carol's voice, like she knew this would happen. Out of the car stepped two officers, both with the same purposeful, no-nonsense walk. Jake's eyes immediately locked onto the officer closest to him. Detective Harris. The recognition hit him like a freight train, but for a split second, he couldn't quite believe it. He had known Harris for years, his old partner in the Undercover unit. But this wasn't a casual meetup. This wasn't a time for a handshake or a friendly hello. Harris's eyes flickered with something Jake couldn't place, but it was more than just recognition. It was something darker, more serious. Jake's throat went dry. There was no mistaking it now. This was a problem. A big problem. "Detective Harris?" Jake asked, taking a cautious step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. He tried to keep his composure, but the adrenaline in his bloodstream made his voice come out as a tense rasp. Harris barely acknowledged him, his eyes scanning the street, before turning his attention to Carol, who stood smugly at the edge of the driveway like a queen waiting for her throne. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" Harris asked, his voice calm but edged with something that made Carol hesitate. His gaze didn't leave Jake, but there was a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head that Jake recognized. This wasn't just about parking. Carol wasted no time. "This man," she said, her finger pointing directly at Jake with alarming precision, "has violated multiple HOA rules. He's parked in unauthorized spots, disrupted the peace of our neighborhood. And I suspect," she paused, as if the words tasted bitter on her tongue, "he might be involved in criminal activities. I demand that you arrest him." Jake's jaw clenched. Criminal activities. Was she really trying to paint him as some sort of villain? This was absurd. But then his gaze flickered back to Harris, and his gut twisted. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a simple 911 call. This was an orchestrated disaster. Harris didn't flinch. He exchanged a glance with the rookie officer, who looked as confused as Jake felt. The rookie took a step forward, but Harris raised a hand to stop him. Instead, Harris turned his full attention back to Carol, his voice low and deliberate. "Ma'am, I'm afraid you've made a mistake," he said, his voice colder than Jake had ever heard it. Carol didn't seem to pick up on the tension. She was still riding the high of her supposed victory, convinced that she was in control. "Made a mistake?" Carol scoffed, her eyes flashing. "You can't be serious. This man," she pointed at Jake again, "has been terrorizing this neighborhood. He's breaking laws left and right. I'm just trying to protect this community from a potential threat." Jake's stomach churned. She had no idea what she was talking about. But Detective Harris's next words shattered any illusion of normalcy. "You've reported an undercover officer," Harris said, his voice steady, but with a hint of dark amusement. "And you've just compromised an ongoing investigation." The air around them seemed to freeze. The words hung in the air like a punch, too heavy to ignore. Jake's heart skipped a beat. His eyes widened, flickering from Harris's serious expression to Carol's growing confusion. "What?" Carol's voice faltered, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. "What do you mean, undercover?" Harris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at Jake, a subtle nod confirming everything. Jake was caught in this web of confusion and chaos that Carol had unknowingly woven around him. The walls of his carefully crafted cover were crumbling, and the woman responsible had no idea. Carol's face turned ghostly pale. Her hands trembled slightly, but she still tried to assert herself. "You can't be serious. This is ridiculous. He's just a—" "Ma'am," Harris interrupted, cutting her off. "You've just called 911 on a police officer." Jake could almost see the blood drain from Carol's face as realization hit her, hard and fast. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. It was as if her brain couldn't quite catch up to the disaster she had unleashed. And that was when Jake knew. This wasn't just about a parking dispute anymore. The truth had just cracked open in front of them, and there was no going back. The silence that followed Detective Harris' revelation was suffocating. For a moment, no one moved. Not Carol, not Jake, not even the officers standing just a few feet away. The world outside seemed to fade away as the weight of Harris's words settled over the scene. Jake's pulse hammered in his ears as he stood rooted to the spot. His thoughts raced. Undercover cop. His stomach churned. He had been living under deep cover for weeks, gathering intel on a suspected criminal network in the area. But how had Carol, this woman, so intent on following her own self-righteous rules, unwittingly set the entire operation on a collision course? Carol's face had drained of color, her hands trembling as if the realization was still struggling to reach her brain. The once confident HOA president, who had strode across the street like a queen on a mission, was now a broken figure, staring at Harris with wide, confused eyes. The rookie officer, clearly out of his depth, shifted uneasily from one foot to the other, glancing at Harris for direction. Harris didn't even look at him. Instead, his cold, calculating eyes remained fixed on Carol, who stood there like a deer caught in headlights. "Ma'am," Harris began, his voice low and controlled. "You've made a serious mistake." Carol's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again, but nothing coherent escaped. Jake watched it all play out, his mind still reeling. This wasn't just about a misplaced parking spot or an overzealous HOA president anymore. This was a full-blown disaster. "Listen to me," Harris continued, stepping closer to Carol, his gaze hardening. "This man," he said, pointing at Jake, "is an undercover officer. His cover was active until you called 911. Now you've not only jeopardized the operation, but potentially exposed him to serious danger." Carol's eyes flickered between Harris and Jake, her expression shifting from disbelief to panic. She took a tentative step back, her hand brushing against the side of her face, as if trying to wipe away the horror that was now sinking in. Jake could feel the tension in the air like a live wire. The rookie officer, who had been standing silently, now stepped forward, his voice hesitant. "Detective, is this for real? This guy's. He's a cop." Harris didn't respond immediately, instead choosing to focus his gaze on Carol, whose every move now reeked of regret and confusion. She was crumbling under the weight of the revelation, and Jake couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. She had gone too far, tried to play hero, but in the process, she had made herself the villain of her own story. "Are you serious?" Carol finally managed to croak, her voice shaking. "How could I have known? I thought I was just trying to protect the neighborhood." "By calling 911 on a police officer?" Harris asked, his tone icy. He took a step forward, and the pressure of his presence seemed to increase tenfold. Carol's hands fluttered, as if looking for something to hold on to. Her eyes flickered toward the rookie officer, desperate for some support, but he said nothing. Jake stood silently off to the side, watching it all unfold. His mind raced, but there was a part of him that almost felt relieved. Carol's self-righteousness had led to this mess, and it seemed like it might finally be coming to an end. But as Harris continued his interrogation, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. It wasn't just Carol's mistake that had put everything at risk. It was what would happen now, how the investigation would be impacted, How many people would know about his cover, and what would be done with that information? How far would this go? Just as Jake's mind was spiraling with questions, a new voice cut through the chaos. It wasn't a voice he recognized, and it was tinged with an authority that immediately commanded attention. "Detective Harris," the voice called. Jake turned, his gut tightening as he saw another officer emerging from the squad car. This one was older, his uniform crisp, his eyes scanning the scene with the quiet intensity of someone who had seen far too much. "Who's in charge here?" the new officer asked, his tone firm, cutting through the tension like a knife. Harris paused, giving a slight nod. "Captain Rojas," he said, turning to acknowledge the newcomer. "This is complicated." Captain Rojas stepped forward, his eyes quickly assessing the situation. The atmosphere shifted. Whatever was happening now, it was more than just a local incident. It was escalating. "Report," Rojas said sharply, his eyes flicking between Carol, the rookie, and Harris. The air grew thick with anticipation. Jake felt himself tense, the unease mounting as the situation suddenly took on an entirely new dimension. And then, with chilling clarity, Jake realized it wasn't just about Carol anymore. The stakes were higher, the implications wider. This was bigger than all of them. Captain Rojas's gaze swept across the scene like a hawk scanning its prey. His eyes lingered on Carol, who had taken a step back, her face pale and her hands trembling. She seemed to shrink under his scrutiny, as if the weight of the entire situation was pressing down on her all at once. Rojas didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, his presence filling the space like an undeniable force. Jake stood on the sidelines, his mind racing. What was happening now? What would this mean for him? For his cover? For everything he had been working on for weeks? He could feel the eyes of both officers on him, and though he had been part of enough high-stakes situations to keep his cool, this felt different. This wasn't just about a criminal operation anymore. It was personal now. Carol had unintentionally blown his cover, and he couldn't help but wonder how far that would reach. Rojas finally broke the silence. "Detective Harris, fill me in. What exactly is going on here?" Harris straightened, his face hardening as he looked at Jake, then back to Rojas. "Captain, this is complicated." The man in question, he gestured toward Jake, his expression serious, is an undercover officer involved in a sensitive operation. And somehow, we've just been drawn into a situation that risks blowing his entire cover. Rojas turned his steely gaze on Carol, who flinched under the pressure. The rookie officer, still standing in the background, shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension. "What's this about an HOA president calling 911 on a cop?" Rojas asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You must understand the implications of that, right?" Carol opened her mouth to speak but paused, her lips trembling. She was caught in her own web now. The force of the question seemed to suck the air out of her lungs. I didn't know. I thought," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I thought I was just doing the right thing. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood from someone who didn't belong here." Rojas's expression didn't change. "You thought?" His voice was thick with disbelief. "You didn't think about the consequences of your actions. You didn't consider the possibility that you were reporting a cop. You didn't even ask yourself why he was here." Carol's shoulders drooped, the fight draining out of her as the reality of the situation set in. She looked from Rojas to Jake, then back to Harris, her eyes wide with panic. I didn't know," she repeated, more to herself than anyone else. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, the tension in her posture speaking volumes. Jake could feel the eyes of everyone in the vicinity on him, and he knew he couldn't just stand there, silent. The way things were unfolding, like a series of dominoes falling one after another, there was too much at stake for him to remain passive. "I'm not here because I want to be," Jake said, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of someone who had been forced into a corner. "I'm here because I'm doing my job. And for the record, I didn't come here to disrupt anyone's life. I came to do what I was assigned to do. Rotus's gaze flicked toward him, assessing, calculating. The tension thickened as the captain took a step forward, now only inches away from Jake. For a moment, the two men stood in an unspoken standoff, the silence stretching long enough to make the air feel suffocating. Finally, Rotus nodded, a subtle shift in his demeanor as he processed Jake's words. "I'm going to ask you to stay quiet for a moment," Rotus said, his voice no nonsense. "I need to know exactly what's going on here. We don't have time to waste." The rookie officer took a hesitant step forward, sensing his cue. He pulled out his notepad, but his eyes were still uncertain, flicking from Rotus to Carol to Jake. His uncertainty was palpable. He had no idea how deep this situation ran, or how out of control it had become. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I've been undercover in this area for the past 6 weeks. I've been investigating a local criminal syndicate," he began, his words coming out slowly, as if each one was carefully weighed. "I've been posing as a regular resident, just another face in the neighborhood, gathering intel on the people involved." Rotus didn't interrupt. The rookie officer's pencil hovered over his notepad, as if afraid to commit anything to paper just yet. "Carol here didn't know that, of course," Jake continued, his voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline. "She just saw a stranger, me, and assumed the worst. What she didn't know is that I've been doing something much bigger than what her HOA rules dictate." Carol's face flushed a deep red. The anger, the shame, the realization all seemed to come crashing down on her in one overwhelming wave. She began, but the words caught in her throat. "I'm an undercover cop," Jake finished, his gaze locking onto hers. "And you just exposed me. You've put everything at risk." The weight of the words hung in the air, a thick cloud of tension that threatened to choke everyone in its path. The seconds seemed to stretch into minutes. Carol stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief, and even Harris seemed at a loss for words. But Rotus wasn't done. "The investigation is compromised now, isn't it?" Jake's chest tightened. "Not yet. But it's a matter of time before it is. This whole operation could go sideways because of one wrong move." Rotus's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Jake saw the full scope of the captain's understanding. This wasn't just a small incident. The stakes had just been raised, and the ripple effects of Carol's actions were just beginning to unfold. Carol's face had turned a ghostly white as Jake's words sunk in, but it wasn't just her reaction that gripped him. It was the realization that time was running out. Every second of hesitation, every glance exchanged between the officers, deepened the hole they were digging. The tension in the air felt like a wire about to snap. Jake tried to focus, tried to push the panic bubbling inside him down. He had been trained for situations like this. The uncertainty, the unpredictable nature of human behavior, especially when things spiraled out of control. But that didn't make it any easier. Not when his entire operation was hanging by a thread. Rotus's gaze was sharp, his eyes flicking to Harris, and then back to Jake. There was a brief silence, too long a pause, before Rotus spoke again, his voice low and authoritative. "Detective Harris, what's the backup plan?" he asked, his tone laced with urgency. Harris didn't flinch. "We need to evacuate the area, immediately. We can't risk Carol, or anyone else, spreading information. Not until we assess the full damage." Jake's stomach twisted at the word damage. This wasn't just about Carol anymore. This wasn't just a small local issue. It was bigger. It was about the mission, the investigation, and all the lives that depended on its success. But as Rotus turned toward the rookie officer, giving quick orders, Jake's thoughts snapped back to the very real consequences of Carol's actions. They needed to contain the fallout, but would they be able to? Or had the ripple effect already begun? As the rookie hurried off to make some calls, Rotus approached Jake, his eyes dark with contemplation. "You need to understand something. Rhodes began, his voice tight with tension. "Carol's mistake is just the beginning. She's not the only one who knows now. Word is going to spread fast, and we need to shut it down before anyone can piece it together." Jake swallowed hard. It wasn't just Carol's paranoia that had exposed him. It was the unpredictability of people, their willingness to turn on someone when they didn't understand the full story. There were already whispers in the neighborhood. People were watching. And when the investigation was compromised, everything would come apart. "I know," Jake muttered, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. "But we can't just wipe this clean. There are people who've seen us, heard us. Carol already made that call. And it's not like we can pretend it didn't happen." Rhodes's eyes narrowed. "That's why we're going to contain this. Immediately." Just then, the rookie officer returned, his face tense, phone in hand. "Captain," he said, his voice cracking with the weight of the situation. "We've got a problem. Word's already out. There are reports of someone suspicious asking questions about a recent crime in the area. It's spreading through the neighborhood faster than we anticipated." Jake's breath hitched. The clock was ticking. "Where?" Rhodes asked, turning to the rookie with a sharpness that bordered on impatience. "Nearby," the rookie replied, looking nervously at the group. "A couple of houses down. Some neighbors are already talking about a stranger. Someone they don't recognize. They're putting two and two together. They're getting suspicious." Jake's pulse quickened. The urgency in the rookie's voice was real, and it fueled his own fear. Everything that had been carefully constructed was now in jeopardy. The investigation was unraveling at the seams, and there was no time to fix it. Rhodes turned to Harris, his expression darkening. "We need to move. We don't have much time." Harris nodded grimly. "We'll contain the damage. I'll put out a statement. Tell everyone there's a misunderstanding. We'll make sure no one talks to the press." Jake felt his throat tighten. A statement wouldn't be enough. They couldn't just erase the seeds of doubt that had already been planted. The neighborhood was already on edge, and soon, everyone would start questioning why an undercover officer was in their midst. The investigation was in the open now. The cover was blown. And then, with a sudden realization, something worse than a blown cover dawned on Jake. What if they already knew? The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. The criminal syndicate, the very people he'd been sent to infiltrate, they might be watching too. They might already know who he was. How long had they been monitoring him? Were they getting ready to strike? He turned sharply to Rhodes, his face pale. "Captain, we might already be exposed. The criminals. We've been dealing with people who don't miss a detail. They could be listening right now." Rhodes's eyes hardened as he turned to Harris. "Get everyone on high alert. We need to protect our assets. Immediately." The air felt heavy with the weight of the situation. Carol stood there, still frozen in shock, oblivious to the gravity of the threat she had unintentionally set in motion. The rookie officer was fumbling with his phone, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. But Jake wasn't looking at them anymore. His mind was racing. His gut told him the worst was yet to come. The criminals could already be on their way. This was no longer about protecting his cover. It was about surviving what came next. The weight of the moment hit Jake harder than he expected. The realization that the criminals could already be closing in, that they might have known about his cover the entire time, churned his stomach. Every instinct he had told him to act, to move, but the scene around him was frozen in a way that made his every muscle tense. Rhodes's sharp voice broke the silence, cutting through the thick fog of tension. "Harris, I want you to head to the other houses immediately. We need to control the narrative. Do not let anyone talk to the neighbors." Harris nodded, but his face betrayed his unease. He was walking a tightrope now, juggling the damage done by Carol's call and the growing threat of exposure. He motioned to the rookie officer, who reluctantly followed him, leaving Rhodes and Jake behind to sort out the rest. Jake didn't watch them leave. His attention was locked on the darkened street in front of him. as if willing the criminals to show themselves. They could be watching him from any of the houses, hidden in plain sight, waiting for him to make a mistake. Every shadow seemed darker, every passing car more suspicious. Rojas, sensing the shift in Jake's focus, didn't waste any time. We don't have much longer before the syndicate figures it out. They'll make a move soon. I'm not going to let them get to you. Jake's jaw clenched, his hands itching for action. You don't understand. It's already too late. If they're onto me, if they've been watching, I'm a sitting duck. Rojas stepped closer, his voice low but firm. You're not alone in this. We'll move quickly, but we need to act before they get any closer. If they know who you are, they're already planning their next move. The air seemed to crackle with the unsaid tension, each word a heavy burden. Jake could feel the seconds ticking away, the world outside growing more dangerous with every passing minute. His entire cover was collapsing like a house of cards. Carol had set everything in motion, but now it was bigger than just her mistake. The criminals he had been infiltrating were ruthless, capable of anything, and they wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who got in their way. Jake, Rojas's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. We have a way out. It's not over yet, but we need to get you out of here. Now. Jake's gaze snapped to Rojas. The captain was calm, but the sharpness in his eyes betrayed the urgency of the situation. Rojas wasn't just concerned about the mission. He was worried about Jake's life. I can't leave, Jake said, his voice rising with frustration. If I run now, I'll blow everything. They'll know something's wrong, and it'll be worse. I need to stay. I need to see this through. Rojas took a step back, his posture unwavering. We're not talking about running. We're talking about making sure you don't become the next target. You're too valuable to the investigation. Jake shook his head, fighting the gnawing fear creeping up his spine. If they get to me before I can finish this, they'll use me as leverage. They won't just kill me. They'll make sure I tell them everything. The brutal reality of his words hung in the air. Infiltrating the syndicate was one thing, but if they found out who he was, there was no telling how far they would go to keep him quiet. The thought of what they might do to him, what they might already be planning, sent a cold chill down his spine. A distant sound broke through the tension, the sharp whine of a car engine revving up, followed by tires screeching against the pavement. Jake's head snapped toward the noise, instinct kicking in. The sound was coming from the direction of the main road, close enough to make his heart skip a beat. Rojas followed his gaze, his expression hardening. It's them, he muttered, almost to himself. We're not going to make it. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears as the realization hit. The criminals had made their move. It was happening faster than they had anticipated, and the fear he had buried deep inside him now surfaced with an overwhelming force. His every instinct screamed at him to run, to find cover, but he knew better than to think he could outrun a dangerous syndicate that had been tracking his every move. Rojas's voice came through the fog of panic. We need to stay ahead of them. Now. With that, the world shifted into motion. Rojas grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him toward a nearby alley. There was no time to waste, no time to think about the consequences. Jake's legs moved on autopilot, following Rojas's lead as the sounds of the engine grew louder, closer. The criminals were coming, and if they had their sights set on him, they weren't going to let anything stand in their way. They ducked into the narrow alley, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. The chaos of the street faded as the shadows closed in around them. The world outside felt like a distant memory, and the only thing that mattered now was getting out alive. Stay close, Rojas hissed, his voice low and urgent. They'll be looking for you. We need to move fast. Jake nodded, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. There was no turning back now. The fight for survival had begun, and there was no guarantee they would make it out unscathed. But one thing was certain. If the syndicate was after him, he wouldn't go down without a fight. The alley was dark, shadows pressing in on them from all sides. The air was thick with tension as Jake and Rogas moved swiftly, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the damp concrete. They didn't speak. There was no time for words. Every muscle in Jake's body was coiled tight, his senses on high alert. His heart pounded, but it wasn't just fear now. It was a mix of adrenaline and the sharp awareness that the endgame was approaching. They turned a corner, slipping into a narrow, deserted street. The sound of the engine had grown faint, but Jake wasn't fooled. He knew they were being hunted, and it wouldn't be long before they were surrounded. They were out of time. They needed to make a choice. Rogas glanced over at Jake, his face grim but determined. "We've got two options. We run for the safe house, or we fight." Jake's mind raced. Neither option was ideal, but running meant exposing himself further. And fighting. Fighting meant putting everything on the line. The criminals were already closing in, and every second they spent in the open increased the risk of them being caught. Then the sound of tires screeching tore through the air, sharp and unmistakable. Jake's pulse shot up. They were here. Rogas grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him toward an abandoned building on the far side of the street. They barely made it inside before the unmistakable hum of an engine grew deafeningly close. Jake could hear the voices now, muffled but clear. The criminals had arrived. They were already scouting the area, their movements calculated and efficient. "We don't have long," Jake whispered, his breath shallow. "They'll come straight for us." Rogas nodded, scanning the surroundings. "Get ready," he muttered. Jake's mind was sharp, every detail of the area coming into focus. The building they'd ducked into was old, its walls weathered and cracked, but it offered cover. He pulled his sidearm from its holster, his fingers cold and steady. He had trained for moments like this. He had to trust his instincts and the training that had kept him alive so far. Suddenly, a noise to his left made his heart race. A figure appeared in the doorway, moving stealthily, a silhouette against the dim light. Jake's hand tightened around his weapon, but Rogas gestured for him to hold. "Wait," Rogas hissed. "It's not them." The figure stepped into the light, and Jake's eyes widened. Standing there, in the doorway, was none other than Carol. She was pale, breathless, her eyes wide with terror. The last person Jake expected to see, standing in front of him with a look of panic that mirrored his own. She hadn't run. She had followed them. "What are you doing here?" Jake demanded, his voice hard. I couldn't just leave," Carol said, her voice trembling. "I know what I did, and I have to fix this. I can't just pretend like it didn't happen." Jake felt a surge of frustration and confusion, but before he could respond, Rogas raised a hand, signaling him to stay quiet. The sound of footsteps grew louder, heavy boots marching down the street, synchronized. The criminals were getting closer, and now the clock was ticking faster than ever. Jake glanced at Carol, who was visibly shaking. She wasn't a threat, not anymore, but she had thrown herself into the fire with them. And now, there was no way out but through. "Listen to me," Rogas said, his voice low but commanding. "We don't have time for anything else. Get ready. We fight here, or we fight on our terms." Jake nodded, his focus narrowing. The criminals were just outside, and they weren't coming alone. He could hear the sound of their voices, low and menacing, as they searched for any sign of movement. This was it. This was the moment they would either escape or be dragged down into the abyss. Carol's eyes met his, filled with a desperate kind of resolve. "I'm not running," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm in this now. All the way." Rogas's gaze flicked between them, then back toward the door. He wasn't giving up either. "Not now. We hold this ground, and we make them pay for what they've done. We don't back down." Jake's mind was clear now. The plan was simple. Survive. With that, he signaled to Rogas, and they moved into position, crouching low behind the broken walls of the building. Jake's breath slowed, his pulse steadying. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for the operation, for everything they had worked for. The door to the building creaked, and the first figure stepped inside. A man dressed in black, a weapon at his side. Jake's hand twitched on his gun. Then, in a flash, everything erupted. The sound of gunfire cracked the air like thunder, the chaos immediate. The criminals had barged in without hesitation, and now the fight was on. Rodas fired first, taking down one of the attackers with precision, while Jake followed suit, moving with practiced ease. Carol had ducked behind cover, her face pale, but she wasn't frozen in fear. She was ready to fight. In the midst of the chaos, Jake realized that, for the first time since this whole thing began, he wasn't alone. He had people beside him, people who would fight with him until the very end. The fight was brutal, fast, and intense, but in the end, the criminals were down, too stunned, too disoriented to mount a proper defense. The tension was finally broken, and the world went quiet once more. But as Jake looked around at the aftermath, a voice inside him whispered, this wasn't over. There was more to this story than he had thought. Much more.